There is a pot in a backstreet kitchen in rural Yamagata, Japan, that has not been touched by soap in over a century. It sits on a wooden shelf near the hearth, its surface a deep, matte black that looks less like clay and more like obsidian, tempered by centuries of use. To the casual eye, it appears neglected, crusted with age, but the woman who stirs miso in it every morning knows exactly what she owns. Her grandmother was the one who first brought that pot into the family, back in the late 1800s, a time when the village still relied on wood-fired Aurori hearths for every meal. The pot was not bought from a market. It was commissioned from a local potter who worked the region's iron-rich clay, a man whose name has since been forgotten, but whose fingerprints remain embedded in the pot's rough, unglazed lip. That pot has simmered miso soup through 3 generations of harvests, 3 weddings, 2 funerals, and 1 devastating winter when the rice stores ran low and the family survived on what the forest provided, all cooked inside that same vessel. And here's the beautiful part. That pot has never once been scrubbed with detergent, not once in over 100 years. Its walls are coated in a seasoning that is not grime but memory. Layer upon layer of fermented soybean paste, dashi stock, and the subtle oils from vegetables and fish that have been absorbed into the clay's porous body. This is not neglect. This is stewardship. But consider this. In most modern kitchens, that pot would be thrown away. Health inspectors would condemn it. Cookware manufacturers would call it unsanitary. And yet, the woman who makes the miso every morning has outlived every non-stick pan her daughter ever bought. Every stainless steel pot that arrived shiny and left scratched. Her pot remains. It is older than the country's constitution. It has outlasted wars, economic booms, and the rise of instant ramen. And it still produces the deepest, most complex flavor anyone in that family has ever tasted. This is where it gets interesting. The science behind this phenomenon is called lipid polymerization, a process that food chemists have only fully understood in the last 2 decades. When oils and fats are repeatedly heated inside a porous clay vessel, they undergo a chemical transformation. The heat breaks down the fatty acids, which then bond with the clay's mineral surface, creating a durable, hydrophobic layer that is resistant to bacterial growth. In other words, a well-seasoned pot does not just hold flavor, it actively repels the microorganisms that cause spoilage. The same process that makes a cast iron skillet non-stick also makes an unglazed clay nabi a self-sterilizing environment. If you have ever scraped a pan and wondered what flavor you were washing away, you know the quiet guilt of erasing a meal's ghost. That is the feeling this pot has never known. Its ghosts have been preserved, cherished, allowed to accumulate into something that cannot be replicated in any laboratory. The pot is not an antique. It is an ongoing fermentation. If this idea of a vessel as a living archive stirs something in you, then stay with this channel for more stories that uncover the quiet wisdom hidden in everyday objects. And while you are here, Let me ask, what is the oldest, most seasoned pot or pan in your kitchen? And what do you think it remembers? Write it in the comments. I would love to hear what your cookware has witnessed. Now consider the miso itself. Miso is a living food, teeming with koji mold spores, lactic acid bacteria, and yeast. When you submerge it in hot water inside a seasoned clay pot, something remarkable happens. The pot's walls, which have absorbed centuries of similar fermentations, act as a starter culture. They inoculate each new batch with the microbial legacy of every batch that came before. This is why the same recipe made in a different pot never tastes quite right. The pot is not just a container, it is a co-fermenter. The woman in Yamagata knows this instinctively, though she would never use those words. She learned it from watching her grandmother, who learned it from watching her own mother. The knowledge is encoded not in books, but in the hands that season the pot after each use. The gentle scraping that removes excess residue without stripping the seasoning. The careful drying in the sun to prevent mold growth. There is a ritual to it, a rhythm that has been passed down like a whispered recipe. And this is the detail most people miss. The pot's crust is not uniform. If you look closely, you can see layers of different shades. Some dark, almost to black. Others a lighter, reddish brown. Each layer corresponds to a different era of the family's history. The darkest layer, near the bottom, dates to the Meiji period, when miso was made with whole soybeans and coarse salt. The lighter layers above it come from the Showa period, when the family began adding a small amount of sugar to the recipe. A change that reflects Japan's post-war embrace of sweeter flavors. In essence, that pot is a library, a culinary archive written not in ink but in oil, protein, and time. Every meal it has ever held is still present in trace amounts, preserved in the polymerized matrix of its walls. A chemist with the right equipment could extract those lipids and reconstruct, molecule by molecule, the diet of a family over 4 generations. They could tell you what kind of fish was caught in the river in 1923, what vegetables were grown in the garden during the occupation, and what variety of rice was harvested the year the bullet train first ran. But the woman does not need a chemist. She tastes it. She can close her eyes and sip her morning miso, and know, through the subtle notes of bitterness or sweetness, whether the batch her grandmother made in 1945 was a desperate one, stretched with acorn flour because the fields had been bombed. She can taste the sorrow of that winter. She can also taste the celebration of the first post-war harvest, when real soybeans were available again, and the miso was rich enough to coat the tongue like velvet. If this made sense instantly, it is because you already knew. Some people hear this and dismiss it as folklore or sentimentality. You are not that person. You understand that objects can hold memory, that a pot is not just a tool, but a witness, and that is why this story matters beyond the walls of that Yamagata kitchen. Because the same principle applies to every pot in every culture that has been seasoned with intention. The Korean tteokbokki, the clay pots used for jjigae, are never washed with soap, only rinsed and scrubbed with salt. the Ethiopian mitat, the clay griddle used to bake injera, develops a seasoning that becomes the signature of the household. The Moroccan tagine, slow cooked over coals for decades, develops a patina that is considered a family heirloom. Every one of these vessels is an archive. Now we must confront something uncomfortable. In the last 60 years, we have been systematically taught to fear these archives. The rise of industrial hygiene, driven by soap manufacturers and later by the food safety industry, has trained us to see any residue as dirt. We have been sold the idea that a clean pot is a sterile pot, and that a sterile pot is a good pot. But sterility is not the goal of cooking. Flavor is. There is a reason why grandmothers everywhere in every culture resisted the sponge. They knew that the crust was not waste. It was work. It was the accumulated investment of thousands of meals, each one adding a microscopic layer to the vessel's capacity to create deliciousness.
No.
To scrub that away is to erase the labor of everyone who cooked before you. So the question becomes personal. When you reach for the soap and the abrasive pad, ask yourself what you are about to destroy. That brown stain on the side of your cast iron pan is not a failure of cleaning. It is a record of every steak you have seared, every onion you have caramelized, every time you deglazed with wine and watched the fond dissolve into something transcendent. That stain is your culinary autobiography. If you feel the pull to honor your own kitchen ghosts, come back for the next chapter of this story, where we will visit another seasoned vessel that has quietly shaped a family's identity. And before you go, tell me in the comments, what is one specific flavor memory that only comes alive when you use a certain pot or pan? Share the dish and the vessel. I want to taste it through your words. The woman in Yamagata knows that her pot will outlive her. She has already trained her niece in the ritual of seasoning, the way to heat the pot slowly after washing, the exact moment to apply a thin layer of oil before storage. She has shown her how to recognize when the seasoning has become too thick, when it needs to be gently scraped back to a thinner layer like pruning a bonsai. The pot is not immortal. It requires maintenance, but with care, it can last longer than any human lifespan. And every time you scrub a pot to bare metal, you erase a lineage. If you believe some pots deserve to keep their ghosts, share this video. Let others know that grime can be wisdom. And if you ever find a pot that has not met the soapy sponge in 50 years, listen closely. It may have a story worth tasting. Subscribe with Miso, and let us keep the old recipes alive together. There is a second pot, hidden in a cabinet above the woman's stove, that she does not use. It is an exact replica of the one on the shelf, made by the same potter's grandson a decade ago. She bought it as a spare, but she has never seasoned it. She is waiting for the day when the original pot finally cracks, as all clay eventually does, from the thermal stress of 1,000 boiling cycles. On that day, she will light a fire, place the old pot in the center, and carefully transfer a handful of its inner crust into the new one. She will dissolve that ancient sediment in hot water, let it soak into the fresh clay, and begin the process of transfer. a kind of culinary grafting. This is the moment where the structure reveals itself. The open loop, the one we planted in the first minute, now closes. That pot has been warm for 100 years, not because it stays on the fire, but because the woman who owns it understands that warmth is not temperature. It is continuity. The pot holds the heat of every hand that has held it, every breath that has blown across its rim, every prayer spoken over its steam. And so the story does not end with a clean conclusion. It ends with an echo. There is a pot in Yamagata that has been warm for a century. There is a niece learning to tend it. There is a new pot waiting to inherit its soul. And there is you, standing in your own kitchen, looking at your own cookware, wondering what you have been washing away. That is the echo. That is the question this story leaves with you, not as a lesson, but as an invitation to taste the difference between clean and alive. The niece will inherit that knowledge, but she will also add her own layer. She lives in Tokyo now, in an apartment with a gas stove that does not hold heat like the Aurori hearth. She has already begun adapting the ritual, seasoning the pot on a smaller flame, learning to read the steam in a room without wooden beams. The crust she builds will be different from her aunt's, thinner, adapted to city water and supermarket miso. And when she passes the pot to her own child, she will pass not a relic, but a living document of adaptation. The old pot remains on its shelf, warm not from flame but from memory. The woman checks it every morning, running her fingers along its rim, feeling for cracks that might signal its end. She knows that each pot has a lifespan, that the clay will eventually fatigue and fail. But she also knows that the seasoning extends that life, that the lipid layer seals the microscopic fissures and prevents the pot from succumbing to thermal shock. The pot is alive, and like all living things, it requires attention. There is a final truth here that we must not gloss over. The pot does not need us to believe in it. It existed before the woman was born, and it will continue to season miso long after her hands have stopped working. The real question is whether we have the patience to let a vessel teach us, to trust that a surface we cannot fully clean may be cleaner than anything we can buy. The answer is written in her morning bowl of miso, dark and fragrant, carrying the weight of a century in every sip.